Across America, BP supports more than 300,000 jobs to keep our energy flowing. Jobs like building grid-scale solar energy in Ohio and producing natural gas with fewer operational emissions in Texas. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.
Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing a new controversy over whether Attorney General Bob Ferguson acted as a legal counsel to the Secretary of State's office on a matter involving Ferguson's candidacy for governor. A growing chorus of local officials moving away from the conventional housing-first approach to homelessness. Public school enrollment in Washington plummeting as spending increases, and an Eastern Washington congresswoman calling out the federal report on the state's waterways. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into headlines. When two men named Robert Ferguson entered the race for Washington governor, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, also named Robert, announced he would seek any available legal remedy to get them off the ballot to avoid confusion with his campaign. The two, quote, fake Bobs dropped out shortly after. News broke that the real Bob Ferguson pushed the Secretary of State to take action against the other Bobs. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell found a new wrinkle in the latest story this week. TJ, give us a little background on the interaction between those two offices.
Yeah, so what happened is the Ferguson campaign reached out to the Secretary of State's office and asked the Secretary of State, Steve Hobbs, to alter the order of the candidates' names as they appear on the ballot so that his would be above the other two Bob Fergusons. The problem with that is that's not how... that the Secretary of State doesn't have the authority to do that. And
yeah, that's illegal, right?
Right. The way the candidates' rankings are chosen is by, I believe, lottery, or you pull it out of a hat. Like that's the order. And so that way it's completely non-biased in how the ranking occurs. But his argument was that if they were allowed, both of them were above him in the ballot. They had appeared first. So his argument was, people would vote for the first Bob Ferguson thinking it was him.
Right. And now we're learning that Ferguson, the Attorney General, I guess I need to specify when you're talking about three Bob Fergusons, may have taken action in his official capacity when speaking to the Secretary of State's office, right?
Well, what we know is that there is a statement from Secretary of State Steve Hobbs in which he says that he received legal counsel and advice from the Attorney General's office on this matter. So what this means is that he was given legal advice from the Attorney General's office as to whether or not he had the legal authority to alter the candidate ranking on the ballot, which included the Attorney General himself, and at the request of the Attorney General as a gubernatorial candidate.
So was Ferguson acting on behalf of himself as a candidate, Bob Ferguson the candidate, or Attorney General Bob Ferguson when he spoke to the Secretary of State's office?
So they had the campaign attorney send a letter to Secretary of State Steve Hobbs. The problem is that the Attorney General's office, the argument is that was a conflict of interest for the Attorney General's office to be providing legal advice to a client on a legal matter involving the head of their, for lack of a better word, their law firm.
Right. Yeah, because the Attorney General is the lawyer representing state departments in a very crude sense, right? Now, aren't there some rules against the state's top legal official acting to benefit his own campaign? I mean, it seems like there's a conflict there.
Well, two attorneys I spoke to, including the former State Attorney General, Rob McKenna, both of them agreed that this was a conflict of interest and that they should have retained outside legal counsel. So they should have brought in someone who was not involved with the Attorney General's office, deputized them to give them a special position to provide legal advice on behalf of their office. And that didn't happen because when I reached out to the Attorney General's office for comment, they said that their attorneys in-house were the ones who gave the legal advice to the Secretary of State's office.
And you also got a letter from the Secretary of State he released this letter saying that he received advice or that he's not going to change the order because he doesn't have the capacity to do that, inferring that he did receive legal advice, presumably from the Attorney General's office, correct?
He explicitly says that he received legal advice from them. What's interesting is we will probably never know this, but what advice did they give him? What was their conclusion as to whether or not he had the legal authority? What was also interesting is his letter said that the law was unambiguous as to this point, that there was absolutely no confusion about whether or not he lacked the legal authority. And so he's being asked to do something by the state's top attorney, the top prosecutor, that would break and violate state law in a way that the Secretary of State believes is not a legally ambiguous point.
I mean, kudos to Secretary of State Hobbs for having the backbone to say, because I'm sure that was a very tense phone call. Can you imagine to be a fly on the wall in that Zoom call is, I'm sure that there was a lot of very suggestive language there from a guy who's going to be the one of the two people that probably become governor of the state of Washington. So kudos to him for following the letter of the law. But what ultimately kind of punishment could Ferguson face for reaching out to the Secretary of State, potentially to benefit his campaign while acting as the state's top attorney, giving him legal advice as his, essentially publicly retained lawyer, I suppose?
Well, if he had been directly involved in providing legal advice, that could get him disbarred. But
that's something.
That is something. But it also the fact that the Attorney General's office made the point that he was not directly involved in any of this stuff in his capacity as the Attorney General. But there's sources I spoke to who said that doesn't matter. He doesn't need to be directly involved for there to be a conflict of interest. And so because you're having subordinates who answer to you giving this legal advice. So there's different arguments being made about what's going on, but you have people who are under the authority of someone who's asking for a change to the ballot, and they're providing legal advice to the person who can make that decision. So
for the benefit of the person that's giving the advice.
Yes.
Fascinating. Do you know, is there any next step in this? Is there any type of formal investigation, or is this just kind of up in the air right now, TJ?
Actually, there was an ethics complaint filed by another Democrat running for governor, Mark Ballot, and the State Bar Association released a letter recently saying that they would take up the matter after the election.
Convenient. Okay.
I also filed a public records request for communications between the State Bar Association and the Attorney General's office, and they are not releasing those records.
We shall see. Good story, TJ. Thank you so much. Moving on, the term housing first is a philosophy that basically says get people off the streets and into a shelter of some sort first, and then tackle whatever substance or mental health issues they may have later. It's been the broad consensus of governments across the country as the preferred method to get tents off of their streets and panhandlers off of the corners, but it's expensive. Now, as Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly reported this week, a growing number of local officials are standing up and saying no help before helping yourself. Tell us more about this pledge, Spencer.
Yeah, so this is a policy pledge from the nonprofit organization named Future 42, and it's had over 40 signatures from government representatives at local jurisdictions across Washington state. Now, this pledge suggests alternative ways to combat homelessness other than the housing first approach. broadly speaking, it recommends stricter laws regarding public camping and a treatment-first approach to ending homelessness by getting everyone full sobriety. That's with the main goal.
Now, service providers like the King County Regional Homeless Authority have found that putting homeless people into apartments can lead to, frankly, trashed apartments. And people are then no better than before they were handed the keys. Is that one of the impetuses for this change in philosophy, Spencer?
Yeah, so a lot of these government-run treatment centers and programs do not require full sobriety. So people can use drugs at these treatment centers, and that could be in part why these rooms are getting trashed, is because people who are on drugs are doing things like this. It's kind of something that was alluded to as part of this pledge, and that's part of why they want to require drug treatment as a full thing.
Yeah, and it also does away. This pledge says that we'll do away with the safe injection sites as well, too, right? Because they see that as part of not helping. And the theory behind that safe injection sites is, okay, well, you're going to keep people from getting bloodborne transmission diseases by reusing needles. They're going to do it anyway. They may as well do it in the environment where if they do overdose, we can, save their life and whatever have you.
And getting the, preventing drug use outside in public on streets where people are walking, going about their day, I think is one of the things about that. But the alternative is that they're just going to continue using drugs and being addicted to, fentanyl, whatever they're using.
Yeah. Well, and to their credit, with the safe injection sites, you, Seattle, downtown resident, you have walked over many a needle just on your normal daily commute, right? So there is, there are benefits to those sites, but I think that the point here is that this pledge is looking a little further down the road, saying, listen, you're not helping, right? And it seems like also this initiative puts a lot of focus on addressing mental health issues, which we found is pretty pervasive in terms of people that are homeless.
So I spoke to Nate Nering on behalf of Future 42, and he was telling me that one of the priorities is building up capacity for mental health treatment beds. There is a lack of such in Washington state. And as you see more and more people who are addicted to drugs, there's also a correlation with mental health issues. And so by building capacity for this, we're able to bring people voluntary or involuntary into these centers so that they have at least a bed to be on and receive this treatment.
And now the pledge doesn't completely do away with the housing first mantra of getting someone into housing first, right? They qualify people. It's more of a trust but verify type situation, Spencer.
Right. And housing altogether wouldn't be just scrapped. There is a need. Nering told me there are families facing financial insecurity and victims of domestic violence who do need some kind of housing, whether it's just affordable or supportive temporary housing. That is still a need here. But when you have a housing first approach, not only is it expensive, as you mentioned earlier, but it takes a long time, and it doesn't get down to what others view as the root of the problem, which is drug addiction, substance abuse, things
root cause stuff,
exactly.
Stuff, right? Now, who's signing, Spencer?
Well, it's a lot of, you're seeing school board members, port commissioners, city council members, and mayors across the state from these smaller cities like Burien, Bothell, Everett, etc. But I think a better way to phrase it is that notably there's no representatives from King County, Spokane, Seattle, Tacoma, these bigger cities that have it, where the homelessness problem is more evident.
Yeah.
And none of that is signed on the pledge. Neither have any state representatives from what I've seen on the list.
Yeah, it's more significant of who's not signing than who is. Thank you, Spencer. I appreciate it. Good story. Public schools cleared out by order of Governor Jay Inslee during the COVID-19 pandemic faced a lot of setbacks. When the districts opened their doors, one of the biggest issues was fewer students came back. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson reported on a new report with these numbers. Just how bad was the decline? Has the decline become, Carlene?
It's a 2% overall nationwide decline in enrollment in public schools. But according to the Manhattan Institute report for Washington State, it is 4%. 4% of students from 2019 through 2024 have exited the public school system. And you may recall that initially after schools reopened post-COVID, the thinking was, these kids are going to come back, right? Maybe they did a homeschool program or something, but they're going to come back to public school. But that has not happened. And in fact, more each year continue to exit.
So the issue was that you had a 2% drop average nationwide, but it was double in terms of 4% in Washington. Carlene, where are these kids going?
Yes, well, some, as you know from where you are, Cole, some have left our state, right? Like literally the families uprooted, moved to another state where schools opened a heck of a lot sooner than they did in Washington State post-COVID. But many have left for charter schools. Charter schools saw a 35% increase in 2020 from where they were. Now, granted, that's a small fraction of overall kids enrolled in public schools in the state, but a huge growth for charter schools. Many of them reopened earlier. And then also huge increases in the number of students that are now enrolled in private schools. And then a lot of the homeschool programs have just exploded. Homeschooling has blown up, like 45% increase in the last few years in Washington. So, that's 35% increase for those. So, it's dramatic, and it doesn't look like now, based on at least these trends, we're a few years out post-COVID, or at least 2 years post-COVID when schools reopen.
A lot of schools nationwide, are seeing more of a leveling out, where the theme is we've reached where we were pre-pandemic in terms of enrollments, in terms of academic achievement, reading at grade level. Now, fewer students should mean schools are fairly cheaper to run, correct? You've got less, a smaller customer base. Shouldn't they be able to operate on less funds?
You'd kind of think that. It makes sense. It's more complicated than that, right? Because districts receive funding on a per pupil basis. So fewer students for, districts overall means less state funding coming in. But it's more complicated than that because we haven't been letting teachers go. That's, teachers unions are very powerful, and the Washington Education Association is considered by national groups to be one of the most powerful teachers unions in the nation. A lot of influence over, in Olympia, and they haven't let teachers go. So class sizes went from, I think that the Manhattan Institute report said class sizes nationwide were at something like 26-1. Back in the 60s, right? Yeah. And now it's like an average of 17-1.
Holy cow.
You've got far fewer students, which should be translating, you'd think, into a better education, because that's been the mantra for these teachers unions forever, right? We need smaller class sizes. But at the same time, here in Washington State, our teachers we're the fourth highest paid in the nation.
Right.
And also Washington students are receiving way more than the national average per student, $18,354 per student in the state of Washington when you add the state, local, and federal resources for students.
A fascinating story, Carlene, and it's you're right. It is very nuanced, and there's a lot of different levers involved that oftentimes logic does not necessarily mean reality. But thank you, Carlene. Moving on, the Washington State River system is one of the most prolific in the country. A recent move by President Joe Biden in a settlement from a lawsuit with local tribes and activists is beginning to form into a concerted effort to get rid of a number of local dams that farmers and the electrical grid rely on. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Clouser reported on the latest news out of D.C. pointed at Washington State. This all started with fish, right, Tim?
Yeah, Cole, there's been ongoing litigation over the federal government's dams in the Columbia River Basin for decades. And that stems from concerns over that the dams stopped salmon from migrating further upstream into the tribal communities that historically rely on them. Back in September, the Biden administration reached an agreement with 3 tribes to restore the salmon in the upper Columbia River Basin, and then expanded that agreement to the lower basin in December, and additionally said it would support clean energy and the general stability of those communities along the river system. As part of that, the administration said it anticipates spending $1 billion in the region over the next 10 years to support its initiative. That money will go towards ensuring reliable and affordable energy, transportation, recreation, irrigation, and other services, especially if Congress eventually grants permission to breach the 4 lower Snake River dams. However, these conversations lacked some stakeholders, such as farmers who rely on the river system to transport crops. In a hearing earlier this year, one representative said that if the dams were eventually breached, it would require 310 more semi-trucks each day to transport wheat to Tri-Cities 365 days a year. To put that into perspective, the yearly total would be 113,187 additional semi-trucks just to make up for that impact.
That's quite the carbon footprint.
Yeah.
Now, what does the U.S. Department of the Interior report that came out recently say?
Yeah, so they just released a report that highlights the historic and ongoing impacts of those federal dams on the basin tribes. In the report, it notes that, 16 million salmon and steelhead fish return to the river system each year, feeding about 130 different species. And they also hold major cultural significance to the tribes. The report also noted, like I said before, the federal dams are blocking salmon from traveling upstream, and also caused massive flooding and ruined a lot of tribal ancestral lands when they were built. In light of that, the report also included recommendations for the federal government as how they could improve their relationship with the tribes, such as upholding their treaty responsibilities, protecting those tribes' natural resources, etc.
It sounds like more of a persuasive essay than a government report. I mean, they couch a lot of the information in the report as being, not biased, but they kind of admit that it's used to support a point, right?
Yeah, the report did include an eye-catching disclaimer. It was 73 pages, and on page 2, it included a disclaimer that said the report does not tell the complete story, nor did it include a full analysis of all the federal dams in the basin, or did it consider other affected tribes. Additionally, the Department of the Interior said it was based on limited sources, and by design was written in a manner to support the conclusions. Quite eye-catching. If you didn't catch that disclaimer, the whole report might be a little misleading.
Yeah, and that got the attention of a local congresswoman who is coincidentally one of the senior members of the party in power in D.C.'s lower chamber, right?
Yeah, Kathy McMorris Rogers had quite the response to this. She's actually the chair of the U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, and she's also from Washington State. So she's from this region, but she was up in air over it. She pointed out the disclaimer and said that it pretty much questions the entire credibility of the report. And she pointed it as just being another example of Biden's, what she called Biden's dam breaching goal, said it shouldn't be taken seriously by the region at all.
Now, you had a statistic in your story that shocked me, and I did not have any idea how much the state of Washington relies on hydroelectric power from these dams.
Yeah, well, Washington's butted right up against the water, and with that, we're the leading state in the nation for producing hydroelectric power. In 2023, about 60% of Washington's net electricity generation came from hydroelectric power. And additionally, Washington state accounts for up to a fourth to a third of all hydroelectric generation nationwide. So breaching these 4 lower Snake River dams would take away 4 out of the state's 9 federal hydroelectric dams, which would inevitably lead to higher bills for local residents. In that hearing I mentioned earlier back in January, the CEO of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association said, wind and solar just don't work as direct replacements for hydroelectric power in the Pacific Northwest. And he also said that it will have an impact on reliable energy in the future if those dams are breached, which would inevitably undermine trust in the local or in the federal government as well.
Right. What they're referring to is called baseload power, where things like solar are not going to provide that base load level of energy transmission if, say, it's cloudy, or wind power is not going to get you that same base level wattage when it's not windy, or they have to shut down because it's too windy. Whereas hydroelectric power, coal plants, nuclear power plants, those are all base level reliable levels of wattage that a state, especially one that's looking to electrify quite a few things before 2030, is going to have to look at with a little bit of urgency if they really are going to allow the federal government to knock down these dams. That is something that's going to be a story that I'm sure you'll follow here for the years to come. Thank you, Tim. And a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories today. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.
BP added more than $130 billion to the U.S. economy over the past 2 years by making investments from coast to coast. Investments like acquiring America's largest biogas producer, Archaea Energy, and starting up new infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.